The mining colony floated like a rusted island in the silence of space, surrounded by a thick band of glowing gas clouds and industrial fumes that never cleared. No matter how many cycles passed, this place was known for its harsh life, and even harsher trades where merchants bartered in metal, tech, spices, and sometimes even in lives. And within this chaotic center of alien activity, a human transporter named Callan walked through the marketplace, his boots thudding against the iron floor, while his eyes scanned the strange stalls stacked with mechanical limbs, pulsing crystals, and crates that buzzed with life. Wasn't new to this. He had traveled across moons and asteroid belts, hauling cargo for credits and dealing with all sorts of shady clients, but something tugged at him as he moved past the row of merchants. A sharp, almost invisible feeling, like a whisper brushing against his thoughts, and that's when he saw it. At first glance, it looked like a small birdcage dangling from a crooked beam wrapped in flickering lights and old chains, the kind of thing used to display rare creatures or tools from forgotten systems. But this was no bird. Inside sat a tiny creature curled in a corner, her limbs thin and delicate, her skin a soft hue that shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, and a pair of folded wings rested on her back, damaged and covered in dust. She wasn't moving much, but her eyes were wide open and alert, glowing softly as they locked onto Callan's gaze. She wasn't blinking, she wasn't pleading, but something in her expression felt deeper than words, a mixture of fear, silence, strength, and something far more ancient around her. Voices laughed, some people pointed, some barely noticed, and others shook their heads at the ridiculousness of such a fragile being held like a toy or an ornament, and Callan found himself rooted in place, unable to look away despite the noise and motion of the crowd around him. He stepped closer, weaving through the bodies of a tall insectoid trader and a woman with a tail of glowing fibers, until he stood in front of the merchant, who leaned lazily against his stall, sipping something thick and green from a metal cup. The merchant raised an eyebrow at Callan and gave a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Callan pointed at the cage and asked what she was. The merchant shrugged and said she was some kind of failed hybrid experiment caught during an off-world raid, probably useless to most unless someone wanted a rare pet or a living trophy. And then he added she wouldn't survive long anyway because she hadn't eaten in days. Callan asked how much she cost. The merchant chuckled and said it wasn't about price anymore, because someone had already shown interest, someone with deep pockets and deeper shadows. Girl inside the cage shifted slightly, her hands gripping the bars for the first time, her head rising just enough to face Callan directly, and then she blinked once, slowly, then again. Like a signal, like a silent code trying to speak across the void between her prison and his world. Wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words caught in his throat because she looked like she had been through things far worse than hunger and chains. Her body looked fragile, but her eyes seemed to carry whole galaxies of pain and knowledge. As Callan turned to leave, for the moment, something inside him felt wrong, like walking away from a spark before it could light a fire. He had seen many strange beings across his journeys, but nothing like her. There was something different, something that didn't belong in a cage, something that felt like it mattered, and without knowing why, without planning or reason, a thought planted itself firmly in his mind and refused to leave. The thought that he was not going to let her stay in that cage, no matter what it cost. Next cycle began with a heavy sky overhead, as if the station itself had begun to feel the weight of all the unsaid things crawling beneath its steel skin. Callan moved through the corridors with a restless pace, unable to forget the small alien girl inside the cage, her face, her stillness, her quiet message. They stayed with him longer than expected, clinging to his thoughts like shadows that would not let go. He found himself back at the local trade bar, a dimly lit place where smugglers and haulers gathered between runs, drinking stale brew and sharing lies about space beasts and impossible winds. The air was thick with smoke and oil fumes, screens buzzed with silent ads, and the smell of burnt circuits mixed with the bitterness of fear that always lingered in these kinds of corners. Callan approached an old engineer who had worked on black market cargo ships and once claimed to know nearly every illegal transport route in the outer rings. The man glanced up from his cup with tired eyes, and when Callan mentioned the caged girl, the engineer frowned deep and slow, like someone remembering something. "Better left forgotten. She's not a creature you want to get involved with," he said, his voice low, his gaze scanning the room, "not because of what she is, but because of who wants her." He explained in a half-whisper that she wasn't just some pet or failed experiment, but a being from a system long hidden from official maps, a system rumored to have creatures that could communicate through thought, reshape energy fields, and remember things their ancestors never told them. Some said she was part of a vanished scout team. Others believed she carried encoded memory strands in her blood. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: she was valuable, and not just for collectors or scientists, but for people who dealt in power, the kind of power that didn't speak in credits but in threats. The engineer warned Callan that someone known only as the Collector had placed interest in her, that this individual was feared across 3 sectors, known for taking rare life forms and turning them into machines of obedience, stripped of soul, kept in golden cages, and shown off like living jewels. The warning sat heavily in Callan's chest, but instead of fear it ignited something else, a quiet rage, not loud, not reckless, just steady and growing, like a storm on the edge of hearing. Later that day, Callan walked back to the merchant stall, only to find the cage still hanging, but now surrounded by a thin force field and 2 guards, with eyes like polished stone and weapons too advanced for street level thugs. The merchant smiled without warmth and told Callan she was no longer available, that the deal had almost been finalized, as she would be picked up by private transport within 2 cycles. Callan looked at her again, her small frame still upright, her glowing eyes still watching, but this time there was a flicker in her expression, something that almost resembled fear masked quickly under her usual calm. He tried speaking through the field's soft words, hoping they might reach her. She didn't move at first, but then her eyes blinked twice again, slowly with meaning, and Callan realized she hadn't given up, not yet. Left the stall, but not the thought of her. He walked without purpose through the alleys of the colony, past ship bays and repair docks, past neon signs and broken bots with sparks jumping from open wires, until he reached his own ship, where he sat in silence, thinking, not about the credits he had or the risk this would bring, but about her silence, her dignity, her courage, in the face of being treated like nothing. Somewhere deep inside him, a choice had already been made, though no words had been spoken, no plans drawn, and no deals offered. Yet he knew he couldn't let her disappear into the hands of those who saw her as a prize. Something ancient and human stirred within him, not for profit or pride, but for something far rarer, the need to do what no one else would. Time moved slower when decisions grew heavier. Callan had faced danger before, crossed lawless sectors, survived zero-gravity fires, smuggled contraband past patrol cruisers, and once even talked his way out of a mutiny. But none of that felt quite like this, the thought of walking into the nest of a known shadow dealer, with nothing but instinct and a quiet promise, held more weight than any cargo he had ever carried. Because this wasn't just about trade or gain. It was about something fragile and silent, waiting to be rescued from a life it never chose. He traced the Collector's name across the undernet, through old contacts and whispered channels, until he found an opening, a small chance wrapped in risk. The Collector, it turned out, had a taste for ancient games, especially one from the old Vega systems called the Throw of 8 Moons, a game built on precision, chance, and reading your opponent. More than the dice, it was played with carved stones filled with magnetic threads, unpredictable yet bound by a strange set of invisible laws. Callan put in a challenge, a direct one through an encrypted channel, stating that he wanted to wager, not for credits or tech, but for the release of the small alien girl, and within a few hours, the reply came cold and simple. The challenge was accepted, the wager approved, and the location set deep inside the older sector of the station, beneath layers of locked gates and forgotten blueprints. where the walls still held the scent of rebellion and old war smoke. Kalen prepared nothing more than himself, and a small memory chip tucked inside his coat, containing proof of ownership of his ship and every last credit he had to his name, because that was the price the collector demanded. If Callan lost, he would walk away with nothing, not even his freedom. He entered the chamber late into the next cycle, a circular room lined with floating screens and strange metal statues. The collector sat at the far end, draped in fabric that shimmered like liquid shadow, his face covered, but his presence sharp like a needle drawn across skin. The table was set with the old Vega stones glowing faint blue, waiting to be awakened. Callan took his seat without a word, and the game began. A match of patterns, guesses, psychology, and trust in chaos. Each round felt longer. Then the last sweat gathered along Callan's brow and back, his hand steady but cold as he rolled the stones again and again, matching the collector's moves, dodging traps, setting his own, until the tension in the room became its own living thing. Watching, breathing, testing them both. Halfway through the game, Callan realized the collector wasn't just playing to win, he was watching. Callan searching for cracks, trying to read the why behind the wager, but Callan kept his face still, his heart focused on the memory of her wings, her eyes, her silence. The final round came with silence hanging heavy above them, the last throw resting between a future reclaimed and a life discarded. Callan looked at the stones in his hand, felt their weight, thought of how many others had lost in this room and how few had walked out with what they came for, and then he let them. Though the stones bounced, rolled, spun, caught the light, and finally landed in a formation older than memory, a sequence known as the Whispering Sky, rare, nearly impossible to plan, almost divine in chance. The room stilled. The collector stared long before finally rising without a word and waving a signal to a silent guard in the corner, and from a small door, the girl appeared. Again, this time not in a cage but standing, tired, leaning slightly but free. Callan rose slowly, his knees weak from the hours of pressure, but his eyes never leaving hers, and in that moment, nothing else in the galaxy mattered. No debts, no danger, no deals, just the quiet connection between a human who bet everything and a girl who had nothing left to lose. She walked to him, each step a fragile declaration of survival, and when she stood close enough, her small voice echoed not through sound, but through thought, reaching into Callan's mind like a breeze through an open window. Not a word exactly, but a feeling, one of gratitude and something else, hope. The walk back through the underground halls felt longer than the journey, and not because of fear or doubt, but because of what followed beside him. Not a voice, not a shadow, but a presence, small in form, yet carrying the weight of something vast, something wounded and ancient. The tiny alien girl moved with slow, careful steps, her feet barely making sound on the metal floor, her head held low, but her eyes alert, scanning every corner, as if expecting the walls to close. Again, Callan said nothing, because no words felt right in that moment. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was thick with meaning, heavier than spoken language, and more honest than questions. They moved together through layers of corridors, past flickering lights, past broken signs, past storage decks filled with quiet, rusting machines waiting to be remembered. And through it all, Callan kept a protective pace, not too fast, not too close, allowing her the space to walk out of captivity on her own. When they reached his ship, a battered freighter with patched panels and humming engines, she paused at the ramp and looked up at the hull as if unsure whether to step forward. Callan waited, arms at his side, eyes steady, offering no commands, only time, and in that still moment, she took her first step inside. Door closed behind them with a soft hiss, sealing out the world, and for the first time since he had seen her in that cage, Callan allowed himself to breathe properly. The ship's lights adjusted, slowly warming the corridor with a softer glow, and he guided her gently toward the medbay, a small corner of the ship filled with old supplies, scavenged scanners, and a chair that creaked whenever it moved. She climbed onto the chair without protest, her movements slow but deliberate, and as Callan checked her condition. He found remnants of restraint implants. Tucked beneath her skin, tiny metal fragments pulsing faint signals. Designed to suppress movement, thought even memory one by one he removed them. His fingers working with care, the tools humming quietly as they lifted each piece from her body, and dropped it into a tray. The moment the last implant came out, something shifted in the room. The lights dimmed slightly, the air grew warmer, and Callan felt a gentle vibration in his mind. Not painful, not loud, just present like a whisper forming words. Made of emotion and memory, he looked at her, and this time he didn't speak with his voice. He opened his mind just slightly, not with force, but with permission, and in that space she shared her name. Leery, a sound not spoken, but felt like wind brushing against a flame, and with her name came images, fragments, pieces of who she had been before the cage, before the market, before the silence. Saw glimpses of her world, glowing fields beneath twin suns, floating cities, carved from crystal rivers of light that carried messages across continents. And then he saw what came after the capture, the chaos, the cold hands, the cage. The feeling of being pulled away from everything known and buried inside her memory was something else, something dangerous. Warning, she was not just a scout, she had been sent ahead to investigate something rising from the dark corners of the galaxy. A presence that consumed not with fire, but with silent systems, vanishing ships found, empty stations stripped of life. As if erased from time, and she had seen its edge before being taken, a glimpse of something vast and hollow moving through space. Like a shadow without form, Callan listened not with ears, but with understanding, piecing together the message she shared. The threat that approached, and the reason her people had stayed hidden so long, because to speak of it was to risk being heard. She looked at him with tired eyes filled with centuries of memory, and asked for nothing, yet everything was in that gaze. She needed help, not just to return, but to warn, to prepare, to stand against what came. Callan sat back against the wall, hands folded, breath steady, and said only one thing, not out of bravery or pride, but because deep inside he knew there was no other answer. He told her she was no longer alone, and whatever came next, they would face it together, not as protector and rescued, not as captain and cargo, but as two beings bound by a moment that changed everything. The ship drifted through quiet space. No destination set, yet no path marked on any known map. Just open stars stretching into darkness, a silence filled not with fear, but with waiting. And inside that old freighter, once built for trade, and now carrying something far more important, sat Callan and Leary, two travelers connected by fate yet bound by choice. Leary moved through the ship like a small breeze, unnoticed by the machines, yet felt in every corner where her presence passed. Her wings, though still healing, began to regain some color, a faint shimmer returning along the edges, and her strength slowly returned with each passing hour. Not only in body but in mind. Callan watched her from a distance at times, wondering not what she was, but who she had become after everything. She had survived. She carried herself like someone who had known stars before. She had known cages, someone who had learned pain, yet refused to let it define her, and in that quiet strength, Callan found something rare, something almost forgotten. In the harsh parts of space, she began to show him things not through words, but through shared memory, pulses that painted entire scenes inside his mind, glowing forests that sang with wind, cities that rose like living crystals floating above oceans of light, creatures that thought in patterns and moved like rivers. He saw all this through her, not as a visitor, but as if he had walked those paths himself. But it was not only beauty. She showed he saw the shadow too, the thing that had taken her world's attention, the thing that consumed not through violence, but through erasure, a presence that unmade whatever it touched, not with fire or sound, but with the complete silence of vanished existence. Entire colonies gone, whole planets darkened like forgotten candles, and at its edge the cold awareness that it was still coming. She had been sent to observe it, to learn if it could be stopped or at least slowed, but her capture had stolen her time, her voice, her warning, and now that she was free, she carried the burden of that knowledge. across a galaxy that would not listen. Easy Lyclin stood beside her at the ship's main console, a map of stars slowly spinning around them as he plotted a route not to safety, but toward where the silence had last been traced. He knew the risk. He understood what it meant to turn toward a threat that had swallowed fleets. But he also knew this was no longer about survival. This was about doing something that mattered. He asked her one question only once, if she was ready, and her answer came not in sound, but in the soft glow of her thoughts pressed gently into his mind, a warmth that said not yes or no, but together. Engines powered up slowly, the ship turning its nose toward the unseen edges of space, where stories ended and new ones waited to be written. And as the stars bent around them in lines of light and motion, Callan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, not safety, but purpose. In a universe filled with war, profit, loss, and trade, where everything had a price, he had found something priceless. Not in metal or memory, but in the eyes of a girl who had lived in silence and chosen to speak through trust. And in his own reflection, he saw not just a man who had gambled for freedom, but one who had been changed by what he found. And as the ship jumped into the unknown, they left behind the world that had looked away and moved toward the one that needed to wake before it too was swallowed by silence. Together, they were no longer just a transporter and a prisoner, no longer a human and a forgotten scout. They were a beginning, a warning, a spark against the dark, a story that would not end in a cage. The end.